With 1AC. The contention is blood colonialism. First, the INA allows for free passage of indigenous people across the U.S.-Canada border, but only if they have at least a 50% blood quantum, which renders the entire statute ineffective at LN 17. In 1952, the INA was amended to include a blood quantum requirement at least 50% to qualify for free passage. This made eligibility depend on racial lineage rather than affiliation with a tribe, tribal membership, and individual self-identification and recognition in one community are insufficient to cross the border. Conversely, an individual can lack all those but still qualify for free passage in line of her blood lineage. And thus, the plan, the United States federal government should implement immigration reform that removes the 50% blood quantum requirement from Section 289 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And blood quantum functions as a critical tool for the colonial nation state that allows imperialism to permeate the mind, increasing the violent impacts of colonialism. Only an active rejection of blood quantum in discursive and political spaces can reintegrate and revitalize indigenous communities towards self-determination. Ferguson 5. Colonialism and racial hegemony create tribal identity crisis, race alienates individuals from tribes while simultaneously enabling racial oppression, oppression, colonization, distracting native people away from collective cultural survival by forcing attention, immediate survival, losing sight of tribal identities. Resolution of crisis depends on an assertion of indigenous tribal identities that oppose and transcend resistance to the reach of imperialism, and nor has there's a great need for those of us who are not considered members, along with those who are, to examine colonialist processes like racialization to develop a critical understanding of how race and blood quantum are part of an ongoing imperialist desire to retain hegemonic control or failure to examine it as evident to convenience responsibility of saying, I am not a tribal member, so I cannot do anything about perpetuation of racism. Is one of the things that enables race suppression to continue under the guise of naturalness. Colonizers, falsified stories become universal truth caricature that distorts experiences and confounds the road to self-determination. They use phenotypical features as identities to remove the barrier from time and space. Their ultimate elements of dehumanization process and cultural genocide. Fundamental remedy to the process of reintegration, remembrance, and revitalization of indigenous communities only attainable through genuine self-determination. And will isolate three specific impacts. The first is statistical genocide. Federally imposed blood quantum requirements are a form of settler colonialism that rely on the genocidal logics of elimination. Jackson in 20. Genocide and settler colonialism work on logical elimination by death, forced displacement, or assimilation in order to open up new lands for settlement. The socio-historical process by which racial identities are created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed. Indigenous people are measured by blood quantum. The explicit federal to use the blood quantum is to liquidate tribal lands and to eliminate responsibility to tribes and would eventually become indistinguishable. Thus, blood quantum is a critical tool of settler colonialism. Indigenous people need to disappear in order to open up lands and resources for whites. And the second is the state of exception. Blood politics accelerates the racialization of indigeneity by subjecting native identities to the pseudoscience of Western thought. This serves to create arbitrary forms of exclusion between too native to be white and not native enough that confound the path to realizing traditional forms of determination, creating a logical foundation for racial genocide. Thiel in 17. To understand blood quantum, one must ask why blood carries symbolic value and effect is visually striking inside and outside the body, both routinely and in dramatic circumstances associated with life and life cessation. Blood can consecrate, purify, can also profane and pollute, can define a community, police the borders thereof. The coupling of blood and nation is by no means natural. Blood carries social meaning as a medium through whose roots are ancient in Western thought. Pure Christian blood emerges from anxiety about the contaminating effects of Jewish and Muslim blood. The blood quantum is a product of colonial pseudoscience that joined ideas about biological substance from Victorian typology, social evolution, racialization with a mechanism that could accelerate the disappearance of indigenous people. Blood quantum figures as the scheme of authenticity that is policed by legal institutions. Blood quantum undermines the authority of tribes and grants citizenship to individuals regardless of ancestry. Once a fluid open and a concept being native became less and less flexible as it became defined by blood. Reliance on blood quantum results in arbitrary forms of exclusion. Blood quantum is doing exactly what it is intended to do, reinforce binaries. And third is immigrant violence. The pillars of racialization on which blood quantum is built create the conditions for violence against all other immigrant populations, where in the West is an always already perfect society meant to cleanse the impurities that originate in the populations they are receiving. The affirmative is a crucial first step in addressing the violence of the immigration system writ large. Quarterwagon 17. Process of racialization are work in policy and discourse that see immigrant cultures threatening to ease link understanding of religion, gender practice, degree belonging, categorization on the basis of ground and transitive sense. Example, blood racialization enables exclusion from social, political, and economic forces, institution practices that shape interpersonal interactions, institutional habits, structural relations, discussing the inability of immigrants to fully participate in society. Called racialization homogenize those who have across the territorial borders, having just arrived, obscure differences between those who settle and have settled and those who are moving through it. It fails to acknowledge that many labeled immigrant are actually second and third generations. These prevent the analysis of differences. Western modernity renders liberation as something already achieved by majority society. Criminality, anti-Semitism, violence against women are all become immigrant problems. And extinction framing is a far-fetched, privileged, and silly abstraction that normalizes violence experienced by indigenous bodies. Only that genocide is the real extinction. Mitchell in 17. Extinction become an emblem of the Western fears of the end of the world. Climate change, asteroid strike, nuclear destruction. Extinction become an empty superlative and abstract form of thinkability. Exposure to fear of extinction contributes to the formation of Western subjectivity. Habit detection is extinction is not quite real for Western subjects. It's a fantasy of negation that evokes thrill, melancholy, anger, and existential purpose. Extinction is not a metaphor. It's a very real expression of violence, and it systematically destroys particular beings. Settlers culture use the violence of metaphorical abstraction to excuse themselves from decolonization. Extinction is an expression of colonial violence. It needs to be addressed through direct decolonization, including the dismantling of several colonial structures. Extinction is embodiment of a particular pattern of structural violence that disproportionately affects specific racialized groups. Extinction is systematically inflicted in order to create space for aggressors, including settler states, and simultaneously enacted genocide against indigenous peoples and their non-human relatives. Genocides of indigenous people continue in peace, and contemporary settler states transformed into multiple manifestations. Biosecurity police, biological boundaries, the security's powerful weapon for precluding flourishing of indigenous people. Extinction is definitely defined by the breaking of relations, the systematic destruction of the conditions of plurality that nurture flourishing worlds. Extinction is not a metaphor for genocide or other forms of logical violence. It is a distinct manifestation of genocide, and asking the genocide logic that drive extinction of all several moves to innocence. Treating extinction is something sort of short of genocide and trenches Eurocentric understanding. A person of the entrenchment of this dichotomy also enables the logic of dehumanization. Racialized people are more likely to suffer from effects of extinction. The violence that drives extinction extends and enact race beyond the category of Homo sapiens by threats to society. Extinction is not metaphor. In many cases, it's quite literally genocide enacted against indigenous people and their other inhuman relations. And the affirmative advocacy for tribal determination is the only way for meaningful change to be made. One-size-fits-all policies inevitably fail. Keelan 17. Blood quantum is so thoroughly permeated ideas of race and citizenship that even the most common alternative adheres to the same logic. Broadening citizenship requirements beyond blood quantum was set towards reversing the attrition of indigenous nations, native nations, plus the racialized risk losing recognition. The double line leaves indigenous communities to exemplify authenticity. Now they're making the United States associated with blood quantum, making a problem that cannot be approached with a one-size-fits-all solution. Is for each tribal community to navigate stripping native people of their land, and epistemology has been a goal of assimilation. People need not be biologically homogenous. People can become a nation, but again, exercise self-determination. And the 1AC's focus on blood politics serves as a crucial vessel to explain white property ownership. Through understanding laws like blood quantum and the one-drop rule, recreate new forms of resistance outside of the politics that allow racialized violence. Casey in 2020. Race and politics in the United States are bound inextricably one another. One political realm of citizenship and U.S. legal action to parse out who would receive full political privileges. In these discourses, this issue of blood is bound to arise. Statute like blood quantum and one-drop rule debated these legacies, racially contingent forms of property and property rights emerged from slavery and conquest. Since the foundation of the United States, the intangible identity of whiteness became the basis of racialized privilege, chronologizing the legal history of the basis of whiteness and property rights from the beginning of U.S. legislation. White occupation, possession, native land was validated as the basis of property rights. There is need to trace the legacy of whiteness and property rights in a conception of native blood from 19th century legislation. Federal imposition of blood quantum concessions of race and native nations, continued reliance on them perpetuates white property rights on native land. Blood quantum fortified native nations against any claims of indigeneity from settlers that concomitantly racialized the property relationship of native people and the land through a blood requirement. I'm now open for cross-examination.
Okay. Your FATO evidence isolates that right now we're using blood quantum to determine who's native and qualifies for free passage. Post-plan, how do you determine who's native?
Tribal determination.
What does that mean? Does that mean tribes just get to choose who gets to cross, or?
Tribes get to choose who are members of their tribes, and if you have tribal membership, you get to cross.
Sure. So how do they decide who's native? If they just have membership, or is it more than that?
It's just through tribal membership.
Okay, sure.
So how each individual tribe decides who is native and who is not.
Sure. Your impacts seem to rely on combating settler colonialism. If the AF is just like settler colonialism and immigration law, how does it resolve other forms of settler colonialism, like the fact that we took natives' lands, or the fact that reservations are underfunded, etc.?
We would argue that the root cause of all of those arguments is explained by blood. For example, the taking their land is explained by the Casey piece of evidence. It explains how conceptions of racial phenotype through blood are what allow white people to claim have a greater claim to the land than other people.
I guess my question is more, how does the AF resolve all of the structural harms the United States federal government has imposed upon Native Americans?
We claim that we are a necessary first step through deconstructing notions of blood.
Sure. So how does getting rid of blood in immigration law make white Americans, or Americans in general, less racist towards natives, less like viewing natives as lesser people, and solve some of the structural problems?
We argue that the United States federal government rejecting blood quantum in every instance, which this is the last instance where it exists in federal legislation, has unique benefits for tribal determination, allowing tribes to determine. Also, we would say that.
So I guess, yeah, you can continue.
Well, we would say that the statistical genocide of tribes through blood quantum requirements is a necessary prerequisite before being able to solve all those other things. If there are no people considered indigenous left, there's no ability to solve violence.
Do blood quantums only apply in the context of immigration law, or does it also apply when it comes to tribes determining who is native and who isn't?
The BIA used to require it, and now they don't. So it's the last federal statute is in the INA. We say some tribes do use blood quantum still, but that is their prerogative, and we say the United States federal government should not stick their noses in it or decide who is or is not native.
Okay, I'll send out the doc. It is up. It's 3 off than the advantage. Anyone not ready?
I got to get it downloaded yet. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you're good.
I have all sorts of cords going around here that I have to get.
Yeah, online debate is a struggle. All the tabs, too.
Yeah. Okay. I'm ready now. Sorry.
You're good. Anyone else not ready? Cool.
First off is T. Restrictions on legal immigration refers to entry quotas or grounds for inadmissibility. Topical affirmatives can lift either. Task off 16. Restrictions on legal immigration. There are two barriers: quantitative restrictions, which limit the number, and qualitative restrictions, grounds of inadmissibility. And violation 1. Blood quantum is a restriction on legal immigration. It's a regulation. They're distinct. Legal by 17. The word restriction is not held to include regulation. And 2. Adjustment of status is a topical. 12. Adjustment of status not involve physical entry. It's not an admission. The circuit courts have consistently held that the plain and ambiguous meaning of admission requires physical entry. There's only one admission. It's based on entry into the U.S., not the attainment of status. And voting issue 2 reasons. 1 is limits. Impossible to research all 1,300 page of visa categories and their associated regulations. Scrutiny and Government 11. Regulations for finding visa policy. 1,300 page of Code of Federal Regulations. And 2 is contextual precision. Removing restrictions on legal immigration should be interpreted as close as to a term of art as possible. It's the only non-arbitrary standard for evaluating interpretation evidence. Consensus of lexicographers vote neg. Shackelford 17. The word restriction is defined by the best lexicographers to mean limitation. The word regulation has a different signification. It means method is defined to be a rule, order prescribed by a superior for the management of the government or society. This more properly applies to the mode and form. The two words are not always synonymous depending upon the context in which the words are used. Next off is the consult counterplan. Text: the United States federal government ought to engage in prior timely binding consultation with the American Indian government over the federal blood quantum restriction on illegal immigration. The United States federal government ought to announce that it will implement the outcome of the consultation and ought to do so once said consultation is concluded. It solves in native say yes, the NCIA 18. In support of indigenous border crossing rights, the U.S., Canada, Mexico government agencies have not given adequate consideration to tribal nations. Tribal governments and First Nations should coordinate efforts when addressing land shared concerns at the northern and southern borders. NCIA does hereby support implementation of the J Treaty provisions in Canada governing border crossing for all American Indian and tribal First Nations and removal of the 50% blood quantum requirement. The U.S. NCIA calls on the federal government to work with tribes to develop a policy regarding tribal mobility and consultation with tribes. And the plan's failure to consult rationalizes hegemonic assertions of power that perpetuate the stranglehold of colonial oppression. Clinton 93. Federal Indian law will sometimes protective of Indians rationalize colonial expansion. The U.S. continues to have hegemonic assertion of power over people. Federal Indian law can be cleansed of its colonial loose, but that task requires consistent commitment. The nation must deal with tribes as it should. Other sovereigns. Decolonization requires that the government no longer dictate Indian policy to tribes, but consult with them actively to reach decision of mutual accommodation. Next off is the 2020 to sad. Biden leads now, but a narrow Trump win is still possible. Swing states are key. The week 923. Both the Biden landslide or narrow Trump win are possible. Biden has led for a year, but this by no means home and dry. A handful of swing states to decide the election. These states, Biden with a polling lead. And Latinx Asian voters are critical to winning those states. Trump's anti-immigrant policies driving them towards Biden, but the plan flips support in the election. Patterson 20. Hispanics and Asian constitute 1 in 4 Americans. Turnout could be accelerating. Turnout jumped by 13%. The largest increase in vote deal for the Republican Party. It's standing among Hispanics and Asians has plummeted. Hispanics have backed the Democratic Party. Republican missteps with the community as long 51% believe that Trump and the GOP are hostile toward the community. Hispanics and Asians attach a high level of importance to this election day. Our key constituencies, battleground states, votes can tip the balance enough to determine the winner, and natives can swing the election. They're typically left out, but the plan swings them towards Trump's. Givens 20. In the heat of 2020 race, the native vote matters. 5.1 million Native Americans are critical voting bloc in swing states, and they tend to lean Democrat. Native Americans are often left out of the election conversation. And a Trump win guarantees great power and accelerates climate change. Both cause extinction. Star 19. The impact of second term would be more lasting. The effects will be impossible to undo. Re-election would put off commitment to decarbonization. Will encourage other country to do nothing irreversible. Tipping points will doom us. 2020 guarantees heightened risk of nuclear accidents and nuclear war. Trump attack on American alliances and withdrawal from treaties have made the world more dangerous. World leaders hoping that he will lose the 2020 successor will new America commits to allies if he is re-elected. Several countries may opt to pursue nuclear weapons. The AF. They can only garner advantages from hypothetical implementation of a topical plan. Allowing advantage from representation in discourse makes being negative possible. There's an unlimited number of reps they can access, and there's no net grounds. Independent voter for fairness and limits. And extinction outweighs bomb bear at 18. Some catastrophes are vastly more important than others. With nuclear winter, humanity can go extinct. Loss of all future generations, 500 trillion lives may be an underestimated risk. Equals probability times magnitude. Society should charge 500 trillion times more harder to prevent global catastrophe than just shave a person's life. Society should make large investment in GCR reduction. Even tiny reductions merit significant effort. While everyone else has the right to own views, the strongest argument for widely held position all human life should be valued equally. Philosophers speak of a veil of ignorance in which considers what's best for society, irrespective of which member they have to be valuing everyone equally, which suggests a very high value for reducing GCR and war outweighs and retrenches structural violence. Horgan 12. No conditions of themselves inoculate against militarism. War causes inequality, scarcity as much as it stems from war is not a product of any single cause. Rather, war fuels sustained injustices. Once we have escaped war, we have more reason to devote to other problems. The economic justice war exacerbates those who want to make the world a better place. Should make abolishing war a priority because peace can bring other changes. And the AF has no definition of what a native is. It begs the question: who does the AF let travel across the border? That puts them in a triple bind. Either A, they still have to use a blood quantum test, which turns 1AC, or B, they let anybody assert claim to being native, which is equally bad because it lets racist white people claim they're native so they can get onto reservations to exploit resources, which turns their AF. And second is it's no AF solvency because natives won't have self-determination post-plan. Or C, they have to use federally recognized tribes, which is bad and causes circumvention. Fershong 16. Obama held Tribal Nations Conference. 50 tribes were not part of the event. 87 tribes have petitioned for recognition. Only 51 have received determination. 2/3 of those were denials. Recognized tribes to receive federal support for housing, education, and healthcare. Recognition of implications across the board. support from domestic relations to education, unrecognized tribes of second-class status and remain vulnerable to the not-so-tender mercy of local and state authorities. Republican leadership has attempted to cut off all funding for the federal acknowledgement process. And double bind. Either A, no risk of spillover. Blood quantum is ingrained in both white and native culture as determinative of native authenticity, and many government policies are based on quantum. Fitzgerald 7. The idea that genetic link has a long history within the native community language of full blood is present. Both the federal government and tribes have based Indian status of blood quantum. BI uses 1/4 blood quantum to services. A large number of tribal governments use blood quantum criteria for membership. Or B, the status quo already solves. Cleary 18. On December 31st, 2018, Trump signed into law the Stiegler Act Amendment of 18, the amendments to eliminate any minimum Indian blood quantum. And they don't solve tribal sovereignty. Simply letting tribes on the border have free travel does not solve the structural issues that exist for Native Americans, such as bad education, sexual assaults, crimes, and other legal issues. And vote neg on presumption. Blood quantums aren't enforced in Canada or the U.S., which are literally the two areas where Section 2A applies. Yablan Zong 08. The free passage statute sole requirement that the person have 50% blood quantum level does not necessarily prevent Canadian Indians with less Indian blood from exercising by Canada does not keep blood quantum records there for any individual recognized as an Indian by Canadian government or by Canadian tribes eligible for free passage, and non-native individuals should stay out of it because there's absolutely no consensus among native nations on whether or not blood quantums are good or bad. The judge has no jurisdiction here. This should be determined by tribes. The plan papers over native requests is an act of settler benevolence in Turns case. Go over 9. Blood quantum rules have considerable appeal in their use of blood quantums. Tribes also transform the concept from a racial to a genealogical measure. They borrow concepts of Indianness and Indian blood quantum from federal policy, but increasingly use these to construct and define a tribe-specific genealogical structure. And the plan doesn't resolve controversies including involving native identity on the local level, which makes the racist exclusion of natives inevitable. This means tribal sovereignty trades off with racial injustice and turns the AF. Moshikini 13. Tribes rely on federal definition to qualify for aid eligibility for programs. These solutions may detract to some degree from tribal sovereignty. This further limitation on tribal self-determination serves the greater purpose of ensuring racial justice. The fundamental unfairness here is that freedmen are being deprived of a right to which they have a legitimate claim solely on account of their racist autonomy should not extend as far as to promote racist policies and outcomes. Federal involvement is necessary to prevent racial injustice. The freedmen controversy serves as a microcosm for greater struggles to strike a balance between tribal sovereignty and federal oversight. Tribal sovereignty does not justify racist policies. All the current legal avenues available to the federal government and its executive agencies not only adequately address the freedmen's grievances to solve the greater problem of fairly defining native identity. Not only must the federal government get involved, it must also redefine tribal membership in non-racial terms, which will have the effect of allowing and encouraging native tribes to do the same. It will not be until this paradigmatic shift occurs that controversies.
I guess the cards mark that controversies. That's the Moshikini mark that controversies.
So you marked that piece of evidence at controversies, and you didn't read this Pruhan 8 on the bottom?
Yeah, correct.
All right, just wanted to make sure. But that every other card in the doc was read. I have them all in my flow. Okay, cool. All right, good?
Yeah.
Okay. T, what's the topical version of the AF?
I don't think there is one. The AF isn't topical. We don't need a TVA.
All right. How does your topical interpretation allow for discussion of indigeneity as it results to immigration law?
We think that if blood quantums isn't topical, then we don't have to discuss indigeneity. You can discuss indigeneity as it relates to immigration law on the neg by reading arguments such as settler colonialism. Or, yeah.
Okay. The consultation counterplan.
Yeah.
We quote consult the American Indian governments over the federal blood quantum restrictions on legal immigration. How many of them have to say no before the counterplan fails?
We think if any of them say no, then the counterplan should fail because you shouldn't decide for native tribes.
So you're saying that if 99% of the native tribes don't want blood quantum, but one does, we should not remove the statute.
We think it's pretty settler colonial to say that, because if one tribe doesn't want it, we just say, okay, we're going to get rid of it. Or if one tribe wants it, we're just going to get rid of it anyways because we're the federal government.
I guess how does devolving to tribal determination about their own identification not solve that argument?
We don't think it solves it because our evidence says that before you have any policy that affects Native Americans, you have to consult them to see what they want on it. Otherwise, you're just making the decision for them.
Okay, but the counterplan treats all Native tribes as one kind of cohesive body and not individual nations, correct? In the consultation?
What do you mean? I mean, we consult
we don't consult each individual tribe. We consult tribes as an entity and then
we consult each individual tribe. If they say no, then we say no.
Okay. Let's talk about the native identity turn. It talks about how tribes relying on blood quantum is bad. Why does the AF make it worse?
Which turn are you talking about? Sorry.
The very bottom, the Musicani 13 evidence. It talks about, yes, the Musicani evidence.
All right, what's the question about it?
It talks about why the tribes using blood quantum is bad. Why does the AF make violence worse?
No, we think that getting rid of blood quantum is bad because it means that natives aren't able to identify on the federal definition of native without the blood quantum, which means they don't get things like aid from the federal government, which is necessarily good for them.
All right, but if Trump already repealed all domestic blood quantum, like your Cleary 18 evidence says, then how is this argument unique?
I mean, even if it isn't unique, we think that tribes should get to decide.
We think tribes should have determination.
If it isn't unique, then the argument probably doesn't apply.
All right. And then finally, why does extinction necessarily outweigh?
We think that loss of future generation on the earth, including natives who wants to stay alive, if they want to be alive, they should be, as well as loss of future generation outweighs.
All right. 4 minutes of prep starting now. All right, stop prep, 2 minutes and 40 seconds remaining. I'll get it uploaded now. The order is going to be case, T, counterplan, disad.
Sorry, you said case at top?
Yeah, case
Okay.
and topicality, then the counterplan, then the disadvantage. So same order in the round against Jenna, just a different counterplan. Is anybody not ready? Awesome. USFG rejecting blood quantum has 3 unique impacts. First is statistical genocide. Blood quantum as a means of membership guarantees that as tribal members have children with non-native peoples, that tribal numbers and cultures dwindle down to nothingness. That's Jackson. Second is state of exception. Blood quantum creates a violent state between 2 native to get benefits of being white, but not native enough to belong to a tribe. Blood works as a way for Western science to explain how black and brown bodies contaminate pure white blood. That's Keel. And third is broader immigrant violence. Systems of racialization and the idea of blood reproduces the basis for violence against all other immigrant populations. It allows the U.S. to draw the line between the good U.S. citizen and the harmful immigrant because of something fundamentally different in their genetics. That allows all problems to be seen as immigrant problems instead of realizing the violence perpetrated by the state. On the line by line, they say that we don't get any discursive impacts. That's fine. We're not going to go for any pre-fiat discursive impacts. We just say they should be weighed first in a post-fiat world. But second, Ferguson says that discourse is inevitable. The words we speak will always have effects on like the world. And through their interpretation necessarily removes critiques entirely from debate because critiques of pedagogy and epistemology, which probably makes it impossible to be negative and excludes critical identity arguments. And go to framing. Reject extinction level impacts. They are used by imperialist governments to abstract violence committed against native folks. Now, extend Mitchell. Extinction, as they posited, is never going to happen. It's only a parallelistic voyeurism of extinction experienced by colonized body every day in the form of genocide. Group their arguments. Their argument that native people, or people includes native people and they all die is probably bad, is a settler move to innocence. Native people are already dying. Your nuclear war has already killed them because they're the ones mining your uranium. You should probably reject all of their extinction level impacts. It's reason to reject the team. The next argument is who is native triple bind. Group it. We say that tribal determination, we default to tribal interpretation, which means it's a third double bind. But we say that coalitions necessarily build post the plan to get more tribes recognized. The next argument they make is the double bind, but it clearly takes out the Fitzgerald evidence because Donald Trump removed all the arguments it's talking about it. The only last explicit one is in immigration law, which means the app is uniquely key. The next argument they make is that it's not used in Canada, U.S. and Canada, but cross-apply Fidel. Yes, the U.S. actually does. The DHS monitors. You have to prove you have 50% blood. The next one argument says the non-native shouldn't speak about it. Why? That's why we say that the federal government shouldn't decide who's native. Why? That's why tribes should decide. Also, Ferguson said that even white people have an obligation to talk about rejecting blood quantum. Otherwise, imperialism just continues to happen. The last argument says we don't create change at the local level, but extend the Ferguson evidence. It straight turns this question. It says that the 50% blood quantum is what makes it so that descendants of freedmen aren't part of tribes. Only tribal determination can solve. Go to T. 1, we meet. We increase the number of people coming to the United States. We meet. We change the type of people allowed in the United States. 3, we meet. The blood quantum restriction is a standard for disallowing immigration. 4, we meet. They can apply for legal permanent residence. And 5, counter-interpretation restrictions can be either qualitative or quantitative in the context of immigration. Posner and Cox. And 6, states can choose numerical restrictions of one extreme state. A person may know another immigration as the other. Unlimited immigration restriction can take various forms. Types. States also regulate the types of people who may immigrate. States favor applicants with desired characteristics, including the ability to speak the native language, work skills, educational achievement, the propensity to obey law, and counter-interpretation. Legal immigration is just the process of getting access to LPR. Robinson and 10. The INA defines legal immigration, the process by which non-citizens is granted LPR, including new arrivals of people in the United States adjusting status LPR. The latter category includes people who arrived as refugees for at least temporary migrants without authorization qualify for LPR. It is problematic to identify legal immigration with actual moves to the U.S. Difficult to measure temporary or undocumented arrivals can be approximated by AOS. And standards versus precision. Our definitions are from legal scholars who have intents to define. Immigration law historically involve quantitative and or qualitative restriction. Second is predictability. There's no bright line for what a quantitative restriction is because they could change who comes into the United States. That makes every half untopical, which is an impossible burden to meet. Third, we are core of the topic. Addressing settler underpinnings of immigration is necessary to understand the entire system. That's the core to WEG evidence. Fourth is negative ground. Only debating quantitative kills negative engagement ability. All DAs become terminally non-unique because the U.S. lets more people in every year. Only allowing for change in types can solve. 5 is predictability. We come from the INA, the governing document on immigration restrictions. Literally nothing more predictable. And they have no topical apps. By excluding AOS, they exclude all refugee and asylee app and EB apps. And solvency advocates and T substantial check their limits arguments. You should default to reasonability. If we win a reasonable interpretation of debate, you should default app. Competing interpretation causes a race to the bottom and substance crowd out. Go to the counterplan. First, consult counterplans are a voter. 1, kills real world education. Consultation doesn't happen in the school on immigration policy. 2, moots the 1AC. They steal the entire 1AC, making it impossible to generate any offense. C, not predictable. Consultation is not grounded in any of the literature. Their lack of a specific solvency advocate proves. D, reading a DA about tribal sovereignty and waiting against the app solves any offense. You should reject the team for fairness and stats. Q justifies permutation, do the counterplan. And permutation, do both. And 3, 1AC was a consultation. We have proven in our research that it's what indigenous folks want. 4, blood turns the consultation. The government only consults true natives based on their racialized definition, ensures exclusion of the most marginalized body, increases the risk of saying no. And no net benefit. The affirmative is negative state action. We don't force tribes to do anything. We just remove a statute that hinders tribal sovereignty in the quo. Vote half on presumption. And 6 is the time frame. DA, tell consultation takes time. That continues imperialism across further temporal boundaries that perpetuates impacts of the 1AC. 7 will straight turn paternalism. Consulting and oppressed people about whether or not we should be oppressing them is pedantic and pretty paternalistic. Stopping oppressive systems is a prior question. And some tribes will say no, extend the Keel evidence. Only allowing each tribe to make its own determination of what it is and is not citizenship is able to deconstruct the violent impacts of white imperialism that has been forced upon their native folks. Some tribes have it so entrenched that they won't give it up as a determinant. And 9, permutation, remove the restriction and consult on whether or not we should reinstate it. And solvency deficit. Some natives don't trust consultation, may refuse to participate. Empirically may refuse to show up for consultation. This McSheffrey in 16. First Nations don't trust federal consultation. Only 3 First Nation speakers turn up for federal pipeline consultation. We don't trust the process, says Grand Chief Phillip. That probably means that it'll be interpreted as a say no because that's how white governments operate. Means that only the AF can solve. Go to 2020. Union is overwhelmed. Biden expanding his lead nationally. Silver 924. On Wednesday, Biden excellently results national polls, including 10-point leads in a high-quality national polls from Quinnipiac University. Market laws will bring the margin of our national polling average up to 7.3 percentage points. And too many thumpers. Silver this morning. You don't need a fancy algorithm. No, Trump is losing. Trump's Supreme Court pick doesn't seem to be helping him. COVID getting worse. The clock is ticking. People are already voting. And it's not unique. Trump outwardly supports indigenous rights and has passed multiple bills in the past year. Proves no link. Shrink out the 19. Trump announced the assigned 3 bills to support tribal apology, compensation on the spoken tribe, reauthorization for funding enabling the federal recognition of the local tribe. The shape of Hawaii's recent month, President attacked several issues that affect Native American community. We remain committed to preserving and protecting Native American cultures, languages, and history, the president said in a statement. And no link. Their immigration links don't assume Canada border. It's not politically controversial. Daily 13. Legal situation of indigenous group along U.S.-Canada border differs from those along U.S.-Mexico. The U.S.-Canada border is a milder political climate than a highly patrolled atmosphere of the U.S.-Mexico border. And they have no unique impact to why Trump 2020 is uniquely bad. Also, all of our framing arguments control this. Go back up to the counterplan. Conditionality as a voter. It encourages strats to by allowing the negative to just kick out of the counterplan, even though we've straight turned multiple times. Dispo solves all of their offense. This comes before topicality because it's a question of time, Stu. I would have had more time to answer T.
Prep. Okay. The counterplay on then T. Anyone not ready? Cool. Anthony's still shuffling papers, so I'll wait. Oh, okay.
We'll concede the perm due to the counterplay. We're not going for all answer. Consult theory first. Counterinterpretation. The game gets one consult counterplay when it solves the applicant. One is education. A subpoint is asked specific. The meeting consult counterplays increases topic specific education, especially regarding immigration policy, because it allows us to talk about what natives think about immigration. B is its real world. When policymakers consider a plan, they always consider the actors and people they affect, i.e. natives. Two is lit check abuse. The fact that the counterplan is grounded in the topic literature and has a solvency applicant mitigates all their offense unpredictability. And three is reject the arc, not the team. We're not going for it, which solves any of their offense about stealing the affirmative. Condo. Interp, we get one with no cross applications against cross advocacy flows. Condom is good. One is its risk averse. It gives negatives a fallback strategy to encourage research as opposed to generics. That's key to topic education. Second is info processing and deciding how to respond to large arguments of information or large amounts of information is a portable skill to confront info overload. It forces the choice of adaptation. Hard debate is good debate. This turns their education standard. Defending against more position net better for research skills. We learn more about immigration policy. Third is Netflix. Condo is necessary on a topic where all DAs are non-unique or politics. There's no generic counterplays. Their interp means counterplays case become bad strategies, which kills core net grounds. It makes being neg impossible because the 2AC always knows what we're going for and spend all their time here. This it turns education and fairness. Air neg, the advocates infinite prep in the first and last speech. Here's defense. Reject the arc, not the team. Time skew is inevitable because we just read more DAs, T's, and case turns. And even if consult or condo is abusive, it's justified because they're on topical. We had no choice. T comes first. Go there now. Our interpretation is topical affirmatives can only remove grounds for inadmissibility or increase entry quotas. That's 1NC ties off. Prefer our evidence. It cites the INA, which is the largest backbone of U.S. immigration law. That's the most accurate definition with the most intent to define. They violate. Blood quantum isn't a ground for inadmissibility or entry quotas. If anything, they're a regulation on immigration, which prescribes specific actions on immigration, not a restriction. 1NC Shackelford says that's distinct and different. You should evaluate competing in terms through a lens of contextual precision, even if their evidence is theoretically preferable. The default 1NC Shackelford, he cites a consensus of lexicographers on the epidemiology of the term restriction. It's the most precise interpretation of the word because every current guideline cites the Shackelford decision. Read our evidence holistically. Only we have intent to define the resolutional mechanism. Tassoff also has the intent to define the term of art, restrictions on legal immigration. The we meets, they don't meet. Group the first two. We group the first two we meets. The app doesn't reduce caps or grounds for inadmissibility. It's a rolling back of a regulation on blood quantum. That's distinct. The limits DA below will apply even if they let more people in. They link to our offense. Now the second one, the blood quantum is a restriction. It's also untrue. It's not a ground of admissibility. Rather, it's a regulation stopping immigration. That's not the same. It links to the violation. They have not read any evidence saying blood quantum is a ground for inadmissibility. At best, they're effects T because they have fiat residual actions that eventually lead to a reduction in restrictions. They can always shift off our offense. That's an independent voter because it allows for an infinite amount of actions that could eventually affect visas, which makes research impossible and supercharges our limits this sad. Their pause, their counter-interpretation evidence, it's awful. It has no intent to define. The evidence just talks about immigration policy, not removing a statutory restriction on immigration, which is what the resolution is about. Only RF uses the phrase as a term of art, which means you prefer it. Their interp blows a lid. Their interp links to our offense because it says things like speaking English, work skills, and education are all topical restrictions, which blows the lid off the topic and it resolves none of our offense. Their LPR counter interp was preempted by 1NC Cecchini. Our evidence says that legal immigration means the initial entry into the U.S., not adjustment of status. It links to our limits offense too because it makes apps which give all undocumented immigrants to the U.S. citizenship or change people here on temporary visas to permanent, which also explodes the topic. I'll do the limits this out here and always all their offense. It's try or die. Even if it's hard to be app, it's possible to be neg without a functional limit. Their interp changes the focus of the topic from large-scale immigration reform to tiny minuscule changes to regulation, including regulation explodes the limits and makes neg research and prep impossible. We have two editorial links. First is that there's over 1,300 pages of immigration regulations. That's hundreds of potentials new app, which is an unreasonable bargain for the negative. Second is exploitation. Debaters will exploit a word with no limits. It creates a race of margins for the small staff. Apps the expedite admissions process, hire more judges and interviewers, eliminate paperwork requirements, pay immigrants travel fees, and give immigrant lawyers all become topical under their interpretation because it may spawn as something restricting immigration. You must hold the line on the phrase restrictions on legal immigration. It's a term of art and only we defend it. Unless their entry quotas or inadmissibility, vote neg. This turns all their offense. Limits is a prerequisite to clash and determines equitable ground. Extreme argumentative nuance and education over core topic controversy only possible under a limited topic. That's key to negative strategy. Exploding neg research borders makes clash impossible. That means every debate involves into a race to margins. Affirmatives ranking small ass about small changes to immigration policy and negs being forced to go for cheating, counterbalance politics, or generics. This adds to don't apply. That's terrible for debate. Only limits ensures the negs prepare to clash, which is fundamental to having an educational debate. Debate is pointless without education, which means it's the biggest impact. Our interp obviously solves because it holds them to entry quotas or grounds to admissibility, which creates educational debates over that. apps like HSI, Family Nurses, and Public Charge are all topical, which prove that we don't make every app untopical. Nothing precedes T. It comes before all other offense, including their consult and condo theory, because it's a question of whether this debate should have happened in the first place. If they're untopical, we're justified in our abuse of strategy since we had no other choice. I'll answer their offense here. First, they say precision. We control precision. Their evidence has zero intent to define, whereas our evidence cites the INA, and uses the phrase as a term of art. You should prefer it. Next, they say that predictability and no apps are topical. They're wrong. The bright line is that quantitative restrictions are entry quotas. That's one NC task off. It means apps that remove quotas or increase allocated visas are topical. That's a pretty clear bright line, and the case list above this proves it. Second is their core of the topic argument. It's infinitely aggressive. We win a violation. It means they aren't and should be excluded. I can say legalizing marijuana is the core of the topic, but it doesn't mean it's true. Even if education about natives is important, it only matters if the neg's prepared for it. They say neg ground limits is key to neg prep. I did that at the top. Even it also answers an extra T argument. If we're not prepared for it, it doesn't matter. If they say no topical apps, I answer that with the case list. Asylum and refugees aren't necessarily part of the topic. They say solvency advocate. It doesn't check. I can find a solvency advocate saying we should legalize marijuana. It doesn't mean that's the topic. T-subs also doesn't check because it's an awful definition, or it's an awful argument. And this definition saying anything from 2 to 100% is substantial. It doesn't matter if there's checks. If we prove you explode limits, you should lose. Reasonability. It's bad. 1, it takes the debate out of the hands of the debater due to its subjective nature. It causes judge intervention where decisions are predicated off of quality of debating or evidence, but rather unquantifiable metrics of how close the judge thinks their evidence is ours. And second, it's a standards debate proves they're not reasonable because they explode limits. You should default to competing interpretations. It allows the objective viewpoint of the topic, which creates a race to the center for the best interim, especially because you should filter this claim through the fact that we are the most contextually precise. There's no substance crowded.
All right, I've got 2 minutes and 4 seconds, I think, starting now. All right. The order is going to be case T. Is anybody not ready? All right. First on the case, I extend the app. They don't answer the app, which means all I have to do is win the topicality debate for you to vote after. I win submission defense. You should probably vote affirmative. Go to topicality. The first argument we're going to go for is the third we meet argument that blood quantum is a ground of inadmissibility. They don't have any definition of what this is. We say that be having less than 50% native blood is a reason why you're not allowed to come into the United States. That means we necessarily meet the Tassoff interpretation. There is no delineation coming out of the 1 and R what the difference between that is and public charge. That means top level we meet. You can automatically pull the trigger there. 50%, if they don't have 50% blood, they're not allowed to come into the United States and get LPR. It means it's not a ground of admissibility. But even if you don't buy that argument, extend the Posner and Cox evidence that it can be qualitative or quantitative restrictions on immigration. There are three pieces of offense that we're going to go for. The first is staff ground. There are no topical AFs under their interpretation that can necessarily solve. They say EB visas is topical. No, there are some people in here already on H-1Bs that would apply for EBs. That means that it links back to the adjustment of status interpretation that they go for here, which means it's not topical. Secondly, we would say they can't solve because there are always regulations that are in place that prevent them from solving too. For example, the per country cap isn't a quota. It's a regulation under their interpretation. The next argument is predictability that we're going to go for is predictability. We remove an INA restriction. We come from the Immigration and Nationality Act, which their evidence is based in, which means we definitely meet their interpretation. The Posner and Cox evidence is really good on this question that says the INA uses both quantitative and qualitative restrictions on immigration. It means that they should be able to predictably research the AF. The third argument we're going to go for is negative ground. All disadvantages are terminally non-unique when you have to remove quantitative restrictions. Look, there is always more people coming into the country. Changing regulations is what allows for things like politics links. The 2020 dissat is based off Trump softening his view on immigration, allowing more types of people into the United States. That's only something that happens in a world where you allow qualitative restrictions. That straight turns their net ground arguments. And on defense, we're going to go for T subs, checks all of their limits arguments. They don't have. We say that if the affirmative can prove that it's substantial, that should necessarily check all the limits arguments. They should be able to predict the affirmative. It limits out all of their case lists because they're only going to affect a few people. The affirmative affects a few 100,000, which means that it should probably be predictable. Secondly, disclosure necessarily checks this limits argument. I disclosed last night that I was going to read this AF against Washburn all day. And Quan, you watched the last round. You knew what the AF did and what it was about. You cut a whole bunch of specific cards. Lit necessarily checks abuse. And you should extend and prefer reasonability. T substantial provides a functional limit on the topic, which means that they don't necessarily have any offense. Even if we didn't win the nitty-gritty of the topicality debate, we are winning that their semantic focus on restrictions versus regulations is necessarily bad. Look, start your decision on the fact that they fucked up by extending the adjustment of status isn't T. It excludes all affirmatives on the topic because there will always be somebody that adjusts status to get into the United States. That makes every AF extra topical, which Quan goes for is bad on top. That means there is no affirmative that can win under their interpretation. If you don't buy that argument, they still didn't handle the third we meet right. Those are your two biggest roads to a affirmative ballot. If there are no topical AFs, limits doesn't matter because the AF loses any debate anyway.
I'm gonna go to the restroom. Good round.
Good round, Quan.
Okay, I think we have a decision. Is everybody here?
Yes. Or I guess I am. Cannot speak for Nick.
Yeah,
Nick
I'm
is
here. Sorry.
All right, James, you back or here or whatever? All right, so the decision is a 2-1 for the negative from Washburn. James, do you want to go first?
Yeah, and I even wrote in my RFD that I'm not going to be surprised if I'm the squirrel, because I think that the neg definitely wins 99% of the round. I am just not left convinced that I fully understand the difference between blood quantums as a restriction on inadmissibility as an I meet to the T, and what it is as a regulation that has nothing to do with admissibility. That is the negatives, that is the affirmatives position, right? So like I ultimately write in my RFD that I feel like the neg is definitely ahead on essentially every other position on T. I think that the neg is definitely ahead in the standards debate, in constructing the affirmatives vision of the topic as far worse than the negatives vision of the topic. I think that the negative is definitely ahead in capturing access to fairness and education as the impacts coming off of the T-shell. And I feel like the negative is definitely ahead in the reasonability versus competing interpretations debate, as something that was kind of undercovered, I feel, in the last round. I feel like many of the arguments that came out of the bottom of the 2AR were new to my flow, things that could have been made in the previous speech. I've also never been one that has been able to figure out how much weight I can assign to arguments like, you watched me run this against your teammate in the last round. That is something that is fun to say, but I'm never really sure how it actually impacts my ballot.
Mhm.
But ultimately, I feel like I'm giving the AF enough access to an I meet at the top level, that I feel like it just kind of filters down to the rest of the T. And I wrote that I think that the negative definitely won the majority of the battles in this round without winning the war on the top level of T to get access to those things. But it was literally just that. If I look beyond the top level of T and I don't give you access to that I meet, this is definitely a negative ballot for me.
All right, I'll go ahead and go, Anthony, if you don't mind. Yeah, I think that's where, for me, I had a few things that stood out other than the T debate. So I would like maybe if you all would be more specific about the tribes, about the natives, right? Because you're trying to talk about how they're very important and how you're advocating for them, but I don't even know who they are, right? And so I think you should spend some time talking about them, and that will uphold more of their voices. I think that the counter plan was should be more read on case, or should be maybe turned into a disadvantage or something. I didn't really like the way it was set up. The disadvantage of the politics disadvantage, I think it really needs to be better. It's just a bad DA. I don't think you need much more work on the politics DA. I think what the round obviously came down to me was on topicality, and it came down to the violation. And I don't think that Nicholas addressed the BQ not being a restriction, and it being a regulation, right? And even if there's semantics, and even if there's a problem with that, I think that the negative does a very good job in creating a delineation between a regulation and a restriction. And even if you don't think that he did, and you say, no, I am a restriction, in your 2AR, you're very passionate about regulations. So you even admit that it's a regulation, and regulation is nowhere in the resolution, the topic. Yeah, you said regulation. You were very animate about it. I wrote it down, right? So I had voted for you before that. I voted negative on T anyway before that, but that solidified it for me. I think that the offense from the negative was really good on topicality, and I think you shouldn't have kicked case. I think you should have focused on case, because if there were some ambiguity between restrictions and regulations and I would have not known where to go, then I would have went to case. And I think that you were winning case very well. And I don't think that the affirmative handled a lot of the arguments on case. So I voted neg specifically on T, and I would have voted on case if it wouldn't have been kicked.
Okay, so for me, I think this round was really super close. It doesn't surprise me that me and James split. I feel like Nick, for me, the 2AR went for way too many arguments for me to understand the IME enough to vote on it. I sat there for a long time and tried to understand the way that the IME played out and the way that your standard extrapolation of how there are no more apps on your topic. And I just don't think you spent enough time there for me to understand it sufficiently to vote out. but I'll go through how I sort of look at the route. So the first thing I look to is the standards debate. I think Quan is really ahead that limits outweighs all standards. So I think that the 2AR's decision to extend things like precision was a really huge waste of time because you're not addressing how that interacts with Quan's weighing of limits. So I think that for me, the whole round structured around limits, Quan wins that limits outweighs. So then I look to the IME level. I think that the 2AR concedes that the third IME relies on effects topicality. That's the second argument Quan made for me. So then I think that, so then I'm not evaluating the third IME because I think that it relies on effects T, which you can see is an independent voter and bad. I also think that on the second IME, the third IME rather, that the app hasn't done enough. I feel like that I don't exactly understand how it functions again because I feel like it just seems to have to rely on effects T to me. So I feel like there needed to be an answer to this argument. So then I looked to the standards about how I guess I look to see if there is at least 2 or 3 AFs under Quan's inter because I think he's one that AF limits are more important than over limiting because the AF has a bias. So then I think that there are a few apps. I don't know. I don't think that the 2AR explanation explains why, like, I don't know, we couldn't remove the cap on H-1B visas and that wouldn't be T. Or like we couldn't offer 1 million H-1B applications to India or something. And like why these visa apps wouldn't be T. So I think that there is like maybe a risk that Quan way over limits the topic, but at least visas are still T. And I think that that's better than having what he says is like 13,000 different apps or whatever. I guess I also looked at reasonability a little bit, but I think that the 2AR is not sufficient there for me. I need one. I don't think that there's an explanation of what reasonability even really means in the 2AR, other than just like we get to sort of meet an interp. I want like a more clear interpretation. Like, does reasonability mean we want interp or T, or like does it mean we need to prove there isn't sufficient offense on the standards debate or whatever? But then also I think that he's one of the argument that creates a lot of judge intervention, which the 2AR doesn't answer. One more thing, Nick, is I also did look to your argument about substantial checking, and that hung me up a little bit too. But it was so blippy in the 1AR. I didn't have it on my flow in the 1AR, and like after the round, I had to control F the doc to find it. So like it was just way just not developed enough, and I think it would have been is what I did to evaluate that is then I thought that the 2AR didn't explain exactly how substantiality resolved the limits debate, because I think that if when I wrote this down on my thing, but I think that the AF I don't think that the AF is doing a good enough job weighing how this solves the limit standard, other than just asserting that it would, which means I sort of default to the risk that it wouldn't resolve the limit standard because I feel like there wasn't enough development on the substantial checks argument.
All right. Thank you, folks.
Yep.
Really, really good round though, y'all. Like great round.
Thank you.
Thanks. Had fun, Nick.
Great debating.
Yeah, good debate, Quan. Good luck the rest of the tournament.
Yep. Thank
Good
you.
job, you guys.
Hey, Reginald, if you're here, do you know where you're going to post the round? I'm assuming the Facebook. You're not here. Fuck it.
I am here, and I'm going to most likely send like the link to my. Oh, he left.
I'll pass it on. I'm curious too.
I was gonna say I'm gonna send the link to Chad, and then he is gonna decide what to do with it. So I would ask Chad where to find the recordings for the round.
All right. Thank you very much.
No problem. Good round.